Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to our audience joining us in DC as well. Thank you for joining us on this third and final day of AGSIW's UAE Security Forum. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We have a very exciting program for you today with 3 sessions detailed on the forum website, UAESF.org, which I will share with you in the chat shortly. And we're honored to kick off this busy day with this first session with His Excellency, Dr. Anwar Gargash, the diplomatic advisor of the President of the United Arab Emirates. Dr. Gargash is recognized as one of the main public voices of the UAE government. He served as a professor of political science at the UAE National University, and in 2006 was appointed Minister of State for Federal National Council Affairs, overseeing the UAE's first elections that year. 2 years later, he was named Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. He continues to help shape the UAE's political and economic future by serving as chair of several government entities, including the National Committee to Combat Human Trafficking and the boards of trustees of the Dubai School of Government. Dr. Gargash will be in conversation with AGSIW President Ambassador Douglas Silliman. Before joining AGSIW, Ambassador Silliman served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019 and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2014 to 2016. He also served as Senior Advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the U.S. Department of State, working on Iraq issues and the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. He also served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, Minister Counselor for Political Affairs in Baghdad, and Deputy Chief of Mission in Ankara, Turkey, among other appointments. And with that, Doug, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone in our audience. And a special good afternoon to Dr. Anwar Gargash, who is not only an important official of the United Arab Emirates government, but also a longstanding friend of the Arab Gulf States Institute. So Dr. Anwar, thank you for joining us this afternoon and for again joining us for one of our UAE security forums. I'd also like to begin by congratulating you and the United Arab Emirates on the just celebrated 50th anniversary of the founding of the country. It has been a consequential 50 years, and I can tell that you have a lot of plans to look at where the next 50 years is going to go. And that's going to be part of our discussion this morning. Our theme for the discussions at the Security Forum this year have been U.S. Gulf relations in a changing region. And Dr. Anwar, if I could ask you to begin the conversation by putting into context that subject and describing for us how you see the historical role of the United States in its relations with the Gulf and as a chief security provider for the Gulf.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Silliman. Thank you for hosting me. I'm privileged and honored to be speaking here. Before I answer that, because it's our 50th anniversary, I think I would like to just give you a small brief about where we see ourselves in the world. I mean, it's been an incredible 50 years in terms of the physical infrastructure that we have built in this country, the investment in human capital, in our economy. Just to give you a small number, in 1975, 3-4 years after the UAE became what it is, our GDP was $15 billion. And today we are $430 billion. So we see this huge economic expansion, and you see it across the board. It's quite substantial. 2020 was a difficult year, but this is a year where we had our Mars probe, the first Arab country to go into space. On the political side, the Abrahamic Accord was also signed in 2020, which is really a very courageous agreement and an important agreement. And we've seen also COVID leadership. So if you look at our numbers yesterday, there were no deaths. We had about 330,000 PCR tests just yesterday. And we had, I think the number was 69 cases. So if you look at the proportion, so we've always believed that science should lead the way in terms of what we see in COVID. In the last 2 days also, I went for the first time to Expo to attend some official meetings, and you could see that we already have about 6 million visitors to that event, a very, very successful Expo. And of course, in this short period also, we will be hosting COP28, the first, really a leading country and a leading voice in the region, because we've been 15 years now invested in the issue of climate. And of course, in January, we have a seat on the UN Security Council, which will also mean that the UAE's position is going to be quite prominent, and we will try and of course support what we see as international governance, etc. So it's really a period of recommitting to our core directions, but at the same time, and I'm sure we'll speak about this more, it's also a period of resetting regional relations. And as I said, with the issue of climate and COVID and multilateral engagements, it's really redoubling our global engagement. So we've had a very successful 50 years, and we intend that the coming decades are also as fruitful, that we will actually continue in many ways to pursue our policy. Now, coming back to the question, the United States continues to be our #1 strategic ally. But we've also, our relationship with the United States has developed. It's a relationship that is not only in the security or energy domain. It might have started there, but we've got many, many Americans living here. We've got, a lot of investments in the United States. We've got a lot of trade with the United States. I personally had an American education, and I'm from a generation where a majority of my high school class went to the United States to study. And as a result, we have huge affinity to America. And, our usual argument is, do you prefer the West Coast or East Coast? It's not whether you like America or you don't like it. And, we go into heated debates. And personally, I'm more of an East Coaster, to be honest, just to lay my cards here on the table. So that relationship remains a cornerstone of our global view. Now, it will really be naive for us to think that relationship is going to be static. And I think this is where we really, where much of the discussion is around. I mean, we look at America's, shifting more to the east. We look at the Afghanistan engagement. We look at the engagement in Iraq and others. The issue, of course, is not about how important America is to the Middle East, because we see America as a positive influence in the Middle East. But the issue is, what sort of shape is that relation going to be? How much of the engagement is going to be there? How much of the commitment will be there? What about the economic side of the relationship? And to be honest, these are all fluid questions, because again, America's relations to the region is very much a cornerstone to it is the Carter Doctrine. Now, a lot of the issues that were involved with the Carter Doctrine have changed vis-a-vis energy and other things, and new issues have really taken precedence. Issues that are to do with soft power, issues that are to do with terrorism, issues that are to do with the economy and the shifting areas of energy. So America will remain important and central. But again, is it going to look like the relationship in the past 30 years? I can safely say no, it's not going to look in the next 30 years similar to the one in the last 30 years. But we need to, in my opinion, visit the contours of the relationship. Now, there's a lot of noise here. There's a lot of noise in this issue. I think we need to pick the signals and differentiate the signals from the noise when it comes to America's place in the Middle East, and when it comes to how will America engage in the region, in the Arab world, in the Middle East, as we move forward.
Dr. Anwar, thank you very much. I like the way that you have framed the question of security in the relationship with the United States as sort of a changing, multifaceted relationship. And I'd like to go through different aspects of that over the course of the conversation. If I can start, though, with one that has gotten the most attention, at least in the United States recently, and that's the security aspect of the relationship. There has been a lot of doubt expressed on social media from pundits, both in the United States and in the region, about whether the United States even wants to continue to be a major security provider or security partner in the region. So how do you see the security aspect of the relationship with the United States, both with the UAE and with the broader Gulf right now at this moment, and what trajectory do you think it is heading in?
Well, again, I think number one is we have no interest in embroiling America in another conflict in the region. If Afghanistan and Iraq were traumatic to the United States, they were also traumatic to us in the region, and the UAE also, which played a role in Afghanistan for over a decade, where we were involved, but at the same time in Iraq. So the relationship, I think we need to avoid a major conflict that will embroil the United States or indeed the countries in the region. I think this is an essential part to understand. America has no interest to go through another long war in the region, and I don't think we have any interest in pursuing another long war in the region. In fact, our interest is to try and avoid it at all costs, even by trying to maneuver a very tense situation. I think this moves us to the second level. So should America depend more on its regional allies in order to secure the region? And I believe that yes, it should, but also regional allies should be enabled. And I think this is an important part in enabling regional allies to play that role. Now, if the United States decides to completely pull out of the region, and I just don't see that as something realistic, to be honest, it means the two concerns that we have are going to be problematic. One of them is vacuums, and the other one is escalation. We need to avoid vacuums, and we need to avoid escalation. So I think we need to reconfigure here, reconfigure in saying that the Middle East remains important for a world and global power like the United States, as it is important also for the countries of the region. But it needs to be dealt with in a different way. I'm not going to say smarter way, because every decade has its own challenges and has its own tools. But I think what I am saying is enable your allies is important. Be able to have what I would call a strong diplomatic also presence in many ways, more strategic military presence. But at the same time, I think we have no interest, or the United States has also no interest in recreating another Iraq situation for all of us, or recreating an Afghanistan situation for all of us. I think we need to also understand that the past decade was an unusually difficult and brutal decade, because there was involvement in the whole Arab Spring issue, with two clear visions in the region. one of stability and one of what I would call radical change, and in many ways also the involvement of radical groups, etc. This is a different decade right now. And I think we need to understand that the different decade, we will be able to influence how this decades develop within reason, of course. And I think our way of trying to influence this, also with US leadership, is to work more and more in creating more partnerships here. I think the Abrahamic Accords is one tool here that we can use. Another tool is what the UAE has been trying to do, for example, recently in our outreach, in our reset with various countries, of trying to find the common economic denominator in order to come and say, we can't negate that there will be areas of political differences, but let us work on areas of agreement and areas where we can have common prosperity. So just to wrap this up, saying that America's role will be central. It is not in our interest to get involved in the same politics of the past decade, but it is also extremely important to try and draw lessons in order to maintain stability in the region, to avoid these two things, escalation and vacuums.
2 days ago, as part of the forum, we had a session with analysts from the region representing both sides of the Gulf. And I was a little bit surprised that the conversation really revolved around the threat perceptions of Gulf Arab states, of the threat both from Iran as a state and also from non-state actors. I would be curious to hear what you see and what the UAE government sees now as the laydown of the most difficult issues facing the UAE from a security standpoint. And if it is in fact Iran, what role do you see for Iran to play in reducing tensions or potentially even playing a role in a future revised security architecture for the region?
Well, again, I think first of all, I think we will all agree that non-state actors are a real threat to the issue of stability and security in the region. Whether these non-state actors are militia that were established in order to address a certain issue, or whether these non-state actors are militias that have become predominant within a nation state. I think that is a given, so I'll leave that aside, but I think this is something that we have to live with, and we have to work constructively to deconstruct this sort of threat that has overgrown in the past period. Now, vis-a-vis other areas, as I said, we have a problem of escalation and a problem of vacuum. Vacuum, we've seen very clearly what happened in Iraq when ISIS suddenly was able to establish its Islamic State at that time. And we might see a danger of a vacuum in Afghanistan with ramifications also in the region, or indeed also in Yemen in this period. Escalation is another area, and I think this is what we are dealing with. So clearly, we do have major differences of view with Iran, and to some extent also with Turkey on many of the regional issues. But I think we have recognized that it is important to manage these differences of views and divergent views, and to try and also buttress other areas of cooperation, and to try and do that diplomatically, try and do that through multi-nation or bilateral economic cooperation. So we're hoping that these functions are going to somehow manage these crises. I'm not going to say that Iran's view on regional issues, certain regional issue, or Turkey's view on a certain regional issue, or indeed our view on a certain regional issue, or Saudi Arabia's view is going to change. But it is extremely important to manage it. Now, the other part of the question is, do I see a period of a greater confidence in bilateral Arab and Iranian relations. And I have to be an optimist and say that that possibility is there, but we have to build towards it. It's not there right now. You know, you don't move from a period of open and hostile confrontation, although not direct, into an area where you can have a dialogue without actually building these confidence building measures. What are these confidence building measures? I see diplomacy as one. I see state visits and open visits as two. And I see, of course, economic cooperation, the sort of return of the bridges of economic cooperation. These are the essential ones. And then after that, you are able to do more and more there. So again, we have our eyes on the JCPOA process. We want to see successful process where we are today, but we're hoping also that process will also lead to some sort of agreement on a dialogue that will involve more countries, and that track in itself will also help, although slowly, but will at least help in cementing this vision that we are trying to propagate of stability and prosperity in the region.
You mentioned limitations in the region, broadening the number of countries that are dealing with some of the difficult political and economic issues. What role might the Gulf Cooperation Council play in this? I mean, particularly after the Al Ula summit earlier this year, the GCC is now more unified and has more possibility of speaking with a unified voice than before. But is there a significant role on the security front, the economic front, or maybe most importantly, the foreign relations front for using the GCC as a mechanism to broaden the number of Arab countries dealing with some of these issues?
Well, Ambassador, I believe, you know, that the UAE has been extremely active and very creative in what it has been doing in the past 2 years. I think this comes from a belief that we have to drive events in the region, and we should not allow the region to drive the events. If we allow the region to drive the events, the region will reproduce the same sort of politics that's been quite difficult. So we really have to drive the events in the region. Today, the Abrahamic Accord is a fact, and people are dealing with it. And in 2 years' time, it will be more entrenched, and it will be more of an integral part of the architecture of the region. And this is, I think, very, very important. I think this is the sort of active, positive diplomacy that the region needs. Now, vis-a-vis the GCC, we have seen, for example, Prince Mohammed bin Salman was here yesterday, coming from Oman, going to Doha. So clearly you have a new climate following Al Ula. We've turned the page. I have to admit that you know that there are areas that will need some time, but I mean practical, functional cooperation is back on track. Now, fundamentally, the GCC has been much better in doing economic stuff and doing a common market than has been in integrating what I would call security architecture in many ways. So again, I think this will be a test to us, but definitely we have, again, a very viable and active regional organization, and we need to work with that regional organization. I don't see it as our single tool, because again, bilateral initiative in the region remains the main initiative. And I think this is what we have seen in the region, because usually collectively you've got different considerations, different calculations. But of course, the collective, when it agrees on something, becomes even more potent in many ways. So I'm hopeful that in this sort of activity that we are seeing, that the GCC will be more and more a player again in many ways. But we do really need to drive events in the region.
You mentioned a bit earlier some differences with Iran and in passing differences with Turkey. Let me broaden the scope and talk a little bit more, not only about regional players, but global players as well. In the United States, there is great concern about the relative rise of China, both as an economic power, but also as a military power, and concern about activism by Vladimir Putin and Russia right now on the border with Ukraine, but more generally, wherever he may be able to expand Russian influence. So how do you see the roles of China and of Russia changing or evolving in the Gulf? And what is the view of the UAE in either cooperation or confrontation of some sort? I don't mean military, or opposition to any of these moves that you think are not in your best interests?
Well, again, I mean, on this issue, I have two comments here. I think, first of all, a lot of our interest, economic interest, is with Asia. It's not only China. It's India, which is in competition with China as our leading economic partner. And we've got a great relationship with India. It's with Japan, it's with Indonesia, whose president was here recently, is with Korea. So clearly, there is also a whole set of difficult relationships to balance in our Asian portfolio in many ways. And I think we're very cognizant with that perspective. A lot of people think that the balance is only between Washington and Beijing. But in fact, it's also a totally important balance within Asia. And of course, we do want to have healthy relations with all these Asian countries. I think that's the first thing. Now, the second part is we understand that there will be a very competitive relationship, and there is a very competitive relationship between Washington and Beijing. And we understand that this is going to be part of the politics of the coming decade or so. But what we are worried is that fine line between this acute competition and a new Cold War. We're really concerned about that, because I think we are, as a small state, we will be affected negatively by this, but we will not really have the ability to in any way affect this competition, even positively, really, to try and affect it. So we're very concerned. We're very concerned because the United States is our main strategic ally. And as I said, China, as well as India, are our main trading partners. And I think from everything I see, that this is going to be the difficult waters that many countries will have to navigate in the coming period. I think the important thing also is to try and this is only really for the great powers to do, to try and manage their conflict and to manage their competition in a way that it doesn't really slip into a second Cold War, which I think will be disastrous for both capitals as well for all of us. I think the Russian role, on the other hand, is important in certain files. It's not perhaps as global as the Chinese. It's important in the energy file because of the OPEC plus angle, and then in some of the regional files, as we are seeing today, for example, in Syria. And I think engaging for us with Beijing and with Moscow, as well as with New Delhi and others, is part and parcel of this new international system. And the international system, I think, as we move forward, will be much more fluid. So we keep a very close eye on Washington's relationship with Beijing, and we're just worried that the competition really becomes some sort of a problematic really confrontation at some stage. And this is something of concern for us.
Well, it's clear in Washington that China, I mean, through the Belt and Road Initiative and through just general commercial initiatives, is trying to do more business in the Gulf, do more business in the region, and have a greater hand in developing areas very close to the Gulf, particularly in the Horn of Africa, parts of Eastern Europe. A question in Washington that for a long time people assumed the answer to which was no, is whether or not China has ambitions to also be a security provider for the Gulf, either to protect its Belt and Road Initiative investments or to help protect the flow of energy that China needs coming from the Gulf. So from the view in Abu Dhabi, do you see that China has ambitions for a broader, more involved security role in the Gulf or in the Indian Ocean basin?
Well, again, I think it's, it is much more difficult to read China than to read the United States because of the nature of the political system and political debate that is there. So to be honest, I don't really see that at this stage within the Gulf area. I don't see it. Of course, the Chinese will have their weapon system that, they will try and sell, or they will have their own interest in some of the issues because they've also been involved with many, many countries in the region. But I really don't see us contemplating that China will be a security provider. And I don't see the Chinese seeing themselves in that role as far as the UAE is concerned.
I'll remind members of our audience that if you'd like to ask a question for Dr. Gargash, please type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're beginning to get a few questions now. So Dr. Anwar, if I might add one of those. One question essentially says, you are speaking that the goals of the UAE going forward are defined in terms of stability and prosperity, economic relations. Does this mean that the UAE is re-examining some of its regional interventions of recent years in the Horn of Africa, in Libya, or other places in the region where you have been sort of both diplomatically and militarily active?
Again, it's a reset. It is a reset. It's a reset that began in 2018 in our final days of presence in Yemen. It's a reset that was influenced by the whole COVID ordeal. And I think from that reset, we realize that the challenges of the next decade are not necessarily the same challenges of the past decade. Now, the past decade was unusually problematic and unusually polarized. So you don't really want to go with the same sort of mental frame of mind into the next decade. I think this is an extremely important reset. But the values are the same. The values are really about, stability in the region, prosperity in the region, the UAE's competitiveness, the UAE's position in the region. So we feel that the coming period, through these sort of very, what I would say, courageous really moves that we have taken vis-a-vis the Abrahamic Accords, the sort of outreach to Turkey, outreach to Iran, the Al-Ula agreement, even the visit to Syria, indicating that after 10 years of war in Syria, we cannot just pretend that we can accept another 10 more years of just managing the Syrian crisis. I think this sort of reset is essential and it is important. And I think the UAE has gone through this reset. But again, we are going to be an influencer in the region, but our influence is going to be through different tools, through this sort of diplomatic navigation, through keeping this balance between all these different relationships that we have, and through also seeking what I would say emphasizing this prosperity aspect of things. So we're not anymore mentioning only stability, but we're saying stability and prosperity. And we're hoping that these are the tools that will be perhaps more conducive and more positive for the region.
Let's stay for just a moment on a security topic. And one of our audience members has asked for your evaluation of how you believe the situation in Yemen is going to unfold in the next year or two. The Houthis have a major drive to take Marib. There has been repositioning of coalition forces and some of the forces, Yemeni forces, inside the country. So things seem to be primed for some movement. But how do you evaluate the situation going forward?
I think right now, there are 2-3 comments here on Yemen that we have. I think the first comment is we really need to decouple a ceasefire from a political agreement. I think we need to all agree on a ceasefire in Yemen, because the ceasefire should be less problematic about the sort of framework of a political agreement and who's going to be there and so on and so forth, and I don't know what. I think we all need to come and agree that we do need an immediate ceasefire in Yemen. I think that's the first thing we need to do. And I think then the international community has got to put full pressure on the Houthis to accept a ceasefire here. I mean, we were 5 kilometers away from Hodeidah, and I was there. I could see the sort of ton of bricks of international concern on the alliance and on the UAE as we were almost on the verge of entering Hodeidah, and we stopped there and we reached the Stockholm Agreement. That sort of pressure needs to be exerted again in order for us to arrive at a ceasefire. In Libya, we don't have a political agreement except after we had the ceasefire. So it is essential to come and say, regardless of how a political agreement looks like, let's get a ceasefire. I think that is the first part. I think the second part is that the Yemeni parties themselves somehow are thinking very tactically right now and not strategically. So the Houthis are looking only at Marib. They're not looking at the whole crisis in Yemen, and are, targeting Saudi civilians with, rockets every other day, for example. That's not really a mentality that is seeking an end to a conflict in Yemen. I think the Yemeni government, the Southerners themselves, all these parties are really looking at tactical advantage right now. And I think that's why the international community and all the efforts should actually be driven towards one priority, and that's a ceasefire. Once we have a ceasefire, at least we have an end to the violence. Once we have an end to the violence, then I think we will have enough room without this threat of violence and suffering in order for us to sort of agree and tweak what a political process should look like, in my opinion. That's my view. And the UAE right now is very much a proponent of a ceasefire. We're very concerned with the continuous targeting of Saudi civilians. We're concerned with this Houthi drive really to continue the fighting because they feel that another 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks are going to change things around. And as we know from the conflict in Yemen, these things are not going to change things around because there are fundamental issues within the Yemeni political milieu that needs to be addressed.
So 2 related questions on Iran. One is actually Yemen related. What role do you think that what role should Iran play in reducing tensions in Yemen, particularly in trying to reduce the drive that you mentioned of the Houthis on Marib, the tactical drive of the Houthis right now? How can Iran play a more positive role, and how can the international community compel Iran to play a more positive role in Yemen?
Well, again, I mean, from everything we hear, there is very little Iranian pressure on the Houthis towards a ceasefire right now. And I think that if you look at the atmospherics of the region, and a region that is trying to heal itself, and a region that's trying to address the brutal wounds of the past decade, I think this should be a start of more and more Iranian pressure on the Houthis to at least accept a ceasefire. And I think from there, allow the various, the UN and other various parties who are working on peace in Yemen, allow them room in order to try and move that forward.
I want to raise a question by AGSIW President Emeritus Marcel Wahba. She asks, what strategies would the UAE like to see the United States implement to reduce tensions with Iran, particularly since discussions in Vienna now on continuing the JCPOA are very much in doubt? How would you like the United States to approach the Iran file going forward to avoid a significant increase in tensions if the JCPOA does not succeed?
Well, I think number one is I don't see further sanctions are as a solution. I think there are already enough sanctions on Iran to move forward, in my opinion. I think that diplomacy is the way forward, but at the same time, we don't also have much time, because there is real concern really about what happens on the nuclear side and its effect on the area really. So what I would really like to see is I would like to see us succeeding in the JCPOA process, and I think the Iranians need to show more flexibility in order to try and arrive at a solution here. But I think beyond that also, if we can really clinch that process of a post-JCPOA and get everybody involved in that process, I think we have another building block there. But I really don't see that reverting to further sanctions, etc., is going to really take this forward. We are in a critical time right now. I remain to be, hopeful and optimistic, but also I would like also, as you know, and you mentioned the issue of Yemen, I would like also to see the Iranians also to see the sort of, as I said, new environment in the region, and to try and be more constructive with this new environment in the region, whether that position is in Yemen or whether it is in Lebanon or in Iraq or in other areas also.
Well, one questioner points out that we have discussed the United States, the UAE's regional partners, Asian countries, Russia, but have yet to talk about Europe or the European Union. And particularly with the very recent active foreign policy conducted by French President Macron in the region, Europe seems to see a role, or parts of Europe seem to see a role that is expanding in the region. What is your view of the future of Gulf relations with Europe, either collectively through the EU or individually with European countries?
We have to differentiate. I think we have to differentiate, and we're talking here frankly, and it's important to be to be straightforward here. I think the French have been extremely constructive. They've taken on some of the very difficult regional issues and have invested a lot of time and a lot of credit, whether it is Libya, Lebanon, or Iraq. And in these files, the French have been present, and I think President Macron's visit to the UAE has been really an unmitigated success, as well as his visit in the Gulf, which was very positive. Now, that doesn't mean that we have the same sort of cohesiveness within the EU policy, because I think the EU policy represents so many states that it is not always easy to get what I would call a consensus. So the effectiveness of French foreign policy does not mean that there is an effectiveness of European policy. I think these are two different things. Having said that, of course, we have great bilateral relations with Germany, with the UK, with the French, and with the EU as a whole. And we're hoping that the EU also will, be more realistic, more practical in terms of the region. Of course, you have to also take into account that the EU is a major contributor financially to many of the problematic causes and problematic countries in the region. And that's very, very helpful, really, in supporting a lot of these countries.
One of our audience asked for you to comment on the recent Wall Street Journal story to the effect that the United States was concerned that China was building military facilities inside the UAE. Again, there was some conclusion in the story, but we'd very much like to hear your point of view.
I think we've had this dialogue with Washington, and this dialogue has been quite, I would say, frank. The concerns that you spoke about, the UAE's view was that these certain facilities were in no way could be construed as military facilities. However, I think the US had its concerns, and we took these American concerns into consideration, and we stopped the work on these facilities. But our position remains the same, that these facilities were not really military facilities. But then again, you have the concerns of your major ally, and I think it'll be foolish for you not to address the concerns of your ally.
Okay. And let me ask you a question of, as the UAE prepares to take on its term on the UN Security Council, you will be taking on a very visible global role. So I have two questions. First of all, a specific one, you have volunteered to help reduce tensions between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. But more broadly, how does the UAE plan to approach its 2-year term on the Security Council?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the first one, and I just want to rectify that. I mean, the India-Pakistan issue is a very complicated historical issue, and for a country like the UAE to claim that it will be mediating in a complicated issue like this would be hubris, to be honest. And we have never claimed to do that. But what we're really saying is we've got our reservoir of goodwill with India, we've got our reservoir of goodwill with Pakistan, and we will use that reservoir to decrease tension. They are two different things. And on a trip with Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, I remember we were in Singapore a few years ago, and it flared up between India and Pakistan. And I remember that he booked a call with both leaders in India and Pakistan and urged them as a friend in order to de-escalate and so on and so forth. The UAE will play that role. It will play a congregating role. It will play a de-escalating role. It will use its good offices. But I think we will not, we understand that certain issues are too emotive and too complicated that we don't really have the sort of historical, and we don't really have the sort of legal or emotional understanding of these issues for us to really jump in and mediate. So I will separate these two things and say we will always play a role with our friends to try and de-escalate, but it'll be very difficult for us to think of ourselves as a mediator in something that's very difficult to mediate, to be honest. And that goes to many other issues. It's not only India and Pakistan. Vis-a-vis the UNSC, of course, this is an honor, and at the same time, it's a huge responsibility. And I think our compass here will be really in global governance. And I know that these will be very difficult and troubled waters, because once you drill down, we will be asked to take very difficult decisions. But I think, on the other hand, we're also the Arab representative there. So on many, many issues, we will abide by the Arab consensus on many issues because we see ourselves as the Arab representative. But I think as a state that has benefited from globalization and has benefited from the rule of law in the international system, this will be really our guiding, sort of lighthouse, so to speak.
This is a difficult question, perhaps, to answer in the abstract, but to what extent will the Abraham Accords and your new and growing relationship with Israel affect your ability to represent an Arab position in the Security Council when there is going to be less consensus on those issues now, perhaps within the Arab fold?
It's a very easy question to answer because Egypt was actually a member in the UNSC and representing also the Arab group, and Egypt at the same time has, of course, a peace agreement and relations with Israel, and I don't see that as a problem. I mean, politically, we are supportive of an independent Palestinian state, of a two-state solution. We are abiding by the Arab consensus on the Palestinian issue, but at the same time, we have reached a point where we believe that not communicating, not reaching out has yielded very little results. And I think if you really look at it today, the most useful two Arab countries to the Palestinians are the Egyptians and the Jordanians. And these two countries are countries that have relations with Israel. So I don't see really a contradiction there.
All right. I have a number of other security-related questions, but I also wanted to get to, in the last few minutes that we have, to your comments about the future of the world, but frankly, the future of the relationship between the United States and the UAE. The UAE has very consciously in the past 5 years tried to redefine security, not just as military issues, but also human security, food security, water security, climate change. How do you see this vision that the UAE has put forward evolving into a different kind of relationship with the United States in the future? And maybe something that has been talked about, should this kind of relationship be codified in some way with an agreement, a treaty, or some other, something other than simply verbal agreements?
You can't remain relevant as a country and as a region if you have no stake in the big global issues of our time. And climate change is one of the big global issues of our time, just as an example. You cannot really keep talking about regional issues, and the world is really concerned about serious existential threat to climate and to the environment that we live in. And I think this belief was also concretized with COVID. With COVID, we realized that supply chains, global healthcare, food security are all essential issues. So I think number one, you do it because you want to be relevant, and number two, you do it because these issues actually affect you. The UAE today has a history of 15 years of trying to deal with the issue of climate and sustainable energy, and mostly through solar power, etc. And as we move to hosting COP28, I think this is something that we want to be more and more engaged. So it makes sense from what I would call a realpolitik point of view, because these are the issues of the time. But at the same time, it makes also sense from what I would call also a moral view of your foreign policy, because these are things that actually affects your population and indeed other populations around you. Now, as we move forward, I think the idea of codifying this with our strategic partner is an excellent idea. And I think from the perspective of the United States also, the UAE really is a living example of an Arab Muslim country that works. You know, you might not be happy 100% at the UAE's record, but this is a country where other Arab youth come to and want to work and strive to be there. This is a country that embraces them. This is a country that is open to various faiths and various nationalities. So you have really, from a US perspective, a real example of how the Middle East and indeed the Arab world works. And I think codifying that and in fact propagating it is not a bad thing.
We only have a few minutes left, so perhaps I will give the floor to you to make a few final remarks. Anything else you would like to tell our audience? My apologies to the 10 or 12 people who have asked questions that we just simply have not had time to get to. But Dr. Anwar, let me give the floor to you for some closing thoughts.
Well, again, I think we are in the UAE recommitting to some of our core directions, really, in the region. And in many of these things, it's issues of people, it's the issues of the economy, it's the issue of prosperity in the region. If we send that message that our view is not only about security and stability, because these security and stability are not attractive enough if you don't bring with it the issue of prosperity. As I said, I think by now, experts who are watching the region, who were a little bit suspicious of what the UAE is doing, are understanding our reason, are understanding that our view of the coming decade is totally different and it needs new tools. And these tools we have reached out to Israel, we've reached out to Iran, we've reached out to Syria, we have Al-Ula agreement, we have to do this and that. And I think the whole idea is we're not going to change these countries, but we feel that through this sort of positive engagement, we will create a reservoir of goodwill that will be used to at least avoid conflict and at least to have more shared platform. I think as we move forward, the region has to be more involved in global issues. The region will not be relevant if it doesn't make itself relevant in issues such as climate change, such as global health and other global issues here. So from that perspective, I think this is what we would like to concentrate more on, to try and make sure that the Middle East, the Arab world, the UAE is represented when the intellectual dialogue on climate change continues. We make sure that our very successful COVID approach is understood and that other countries understand that there are states here with capability and capacity that can do these jobs, and then this will open up the gates for further cooperation. And as you mentioned also, with our UN Security Council role, we would like to support more and more this whole idea of global governance, because for states our size, this is really our ultimate insurance.
Dr. Anwar Gargash, thank you very much for joining us today for the 6th iteration of the UAE Security Forum. My dear thanks to you. Congratulations again to you and to the UAE on the celebration of your 50th anniversary. To the rest of the audience, I invite you all to stay tuned for the remaining 2 sessions of our forum today. We have 2 very good sessions in about 30 minutes at 9:30 Eastern Time, 5:30 p.m. Arabian time, and 6:30 p.m. Gulf time. On the same Zoom link, we will have our session on economic ties and shared prosperity, which will begin to discuss some of the non-military aspects of security of the Gulf. And then at 11 a.m. Eastern time, 7 p.m. Arabian time, and 8 p.m. Gulf time, we'll have our second keynote conversation with Brett McGurk, White House Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa. That session will be in a separate Zoom link, which we will try to drop into the chat for you now and also in our economic forum. And if you have any questions of how to get access to that conversation, please send an email to info@agsiw.org, and we will send you the link directly. So Dr. Anwar, thank you very much. Good evening in Abu Dhabi, and we'll see everyone else, we hope, in 30 minutes. Farewell.